Okay, hello everybody. We're going to get started for today's class session. So I'm a couple minutes behind here for those of you on the live feed. A little trouble getting set up here, but we're ready to pick up and leave, pick up where we left off on Monday. And so we're covering chapter 10 right now, which deals with monopolistic competition and oligopoly. And whether or not we get to chapter 11 today is, sort of up in the air. In fact, a lot of this is sort of maybe a little bit optimistic. Chapters 12 and 13 are going to go together, really. In fact, I think I left something off here, didn't I? Chapters 12 and 13, in a lot of textbooks, these actually, 12 and 13 actually sort of go together. And they deal with something called externalities, which is really our attempt here to sort of bring in, the third of those active groups, since we did some discussion about infant households, particularly in their role as consumers. And we've been, for the last several class sessions, talking about the economics of business firms from the standpoint of cost and output and profit. And that's what we're going to be finishing up today. Chapter 11 goes pretty quickly, which is why I sort of included it in today's sort of projection as to where we will get. I'm not going to cover everything in chapter 11. I think I mentioned in class on Monday that there's some discussion about regulation of natural monopolies, which I think I'm not real satisfied with, to tell you the truth. And in some ways, it really sort of is 300 level in some ways. I think I'd rather, if you really are interested in that, you have opportunities to take a 300 level micro course at some point, and they'll get into that a lot deeper than what we're really able to get into. And I know that I included that as a line item on the in Brightspace as one of the course objectives for the week. But I think I'm going to defer, or well, not defer, just not talk about it in this course, but I will talk about antitrust laws, antitrust regulation, how we enforce antitrust laws, and all those things are really important for us to really sort of understand how we understand the economics of market structure, in particular from the standpoint of government and government's role in sort of protecting society from the abuses of market power, which obviously are made most manifest in monopoly that we talked about in chapter 9. That is, if you've got one supplier of a good, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that obviously needs really no elaboration, is the idea that it's one seller can dictate the price of the good, and they do it by simply controlling the output, thereby selling to the portion of the demand function that will buy the good at that price. And that will be their profit maximizing level of output. And all firms and all industries will produce at the same sort of technical output level. That's where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We certainly saw that in the case of both perfect competition and monopoly. And Monday we did that with monopolistic competition. And we'll talk about oligopoly, which is the last of the market structures. And then that's a really good segue to chapter 11, which deals with sort of this idea of regulation and what we do about it, and why laws are passed to protect the public from really what could be overweening market power. Next week, 12 and 13 are going to be really the main focus of what we're going to be looking at. When we talk about externalities, we're talking about the idea that industries don't exist in a vacuum, in a closed system where they simply produce goods, everybody goes home and everyone's happy and all that. Instead, they produce spillover effects onto communities, onto the environment, onto the general public, in terms of things like product safety, in terms of pollution. And there's probably been more microeconomic research done in the area of pollution than maybe any other topic when it comes to externalities. And that's the idea of what can firms do, or how can firms be required or even incentivized to limit the amount of pollution that they create. Air pollution, noise pollution, water pollution, all of those kinds of things is a really, really important topic. It is not getting any less important. It's going to be more important as we go forward. And to the point where I think every generation that comes along looks with horror at what previous generations did or did not do with regard to environmental protection. That is, there's always room for improvement. And the original industrialists didn't seem to care at all about the environment. And now we are really forced to for our own survival. And global climate change is a real thing. And I'm not a climate scientist, so I can't speak with any authority about what it's about, other than the fact that I take the word of those who do study it that it's not some giant hoax perpetrated by scientists somewhere. I don't know why they would want to do that, stake their own professional reputation on some sort of grand hoax. So it's a real thing, and it's something we really need to address, even on a more global basis. And it's going to be one of the big macro topics, frankly, as we go forward. Chapter 16 is really sort of an interesting chapter. I like to talk about, if we don't get to it, we don't get to it, but I think we will. By the way, we're not covering chapter 14, so just kind of scratch that on your syllabus. I sort of noted with regret that I really wanted to get to that chapter because we were skipping over the labor piece in chapter 4, mostly because at the time, as you might recall, I thought it was kind of muddled with the sort of, I don't know, discussion of an economics of financial markets, which, you know, is interesting. A lot of people like that, and I like it too, but it doesn't really seem to fit very well, particularly with its juxtaposition with labor. I thought that was sort of an odd thing, and so I thought we'd pick it up in chapter 14. But I feel like I've satisfied myself that we have covered a lot of labor up to this point, so I don't think we're giving labor a short shrift at all. We've talked about wages and whatnot, and so we will, but not be covering chapter 14. Week 14, 2 weeks from now, we'll review for the 4th exam. I know they're coming faster now, but that was the way it's sort of designed. Fewer chapters, more frequent exams. Again, in the first 4 exams, we drop the lowest score, so it just goes away. So there are 400 points possible for the first 4 exams. Since we dropped the lowest one, those account for 300 points. Of the 400 points possible in the course, the last 100 points being the final exam, and that's not to be dropped because the school requires us to have some final activity for this course. Okay, so questions for me about anything that we're up to now and where we're going and all that. Okay, again, I can't hear you. I'm sorry. It's my fault, really. I wish I had been conscious of that when we first got this room, that I was unable to hear students because the other, I guess there were another couple classrooms, 2 or 3 classrooms that I had for different programs where we've used the Attend Anywhere format, the Zoom format, even prior to the pandemic, actually. And I can always hear students on the microphones. I think this is older technology. And the maddening thing is we've got sort of bits and pieces of technology that have come at different times, and whatever room you're assigned to, we have different machines. I usually have to have somebody come show me how to work the remotes and all that. So that's just my own ignorance there. But I can see what you're chatting. If you put something in the chat box, I can see it very well from here. So feel free to hit me up if you have questions, or get with me anytime you like. If you want me to call you, I'll call you, or you can meet with me if you like. That's fine too. Whatever you prefer. The name of the game with the Attend Anywhere sections is flexibility, and those of us who are instructors in this program have committed to that flexibility because we realize that you are busy too, and I do value your time. I really do. Okay, and I mean that. So, all right. So let's move on to where we were last time, where we talked about economic profit, and we talked about this idea of economic profit with regard to monopolistic competition. And let me, as best I can, because this is a little bit tricky to do freehand, and I admit to not being the greatest artist in the world, but if you have just a basic PQ plane like that, and I usually represent the vertical axis with a dollar symbol, mostly because of the fact that we are overlaying cost in addition to price. So, but both are denominated in dollars, and so I'll just simply put a dollar figure there. We know that in monopolistic competition, like all of those 3 industries that are imperfectly competitive, monopoly, monopolistic competition, and oligopoly, those 3 are all sort of lumped together in one category that we call imperfect competition. In other words, they're defined by what they're not. That is, they are not that most extreme form of hyper-competitiveness of perfect competition, where firms are price takers, can't do anything about the price of the good. They can only take the price and produce whatever output makes sense for themselves individually as sellers. No cooperation with others, no real ability, there's no real need to spy on your competitors. We'll talk a bit about that with the next topic, oligopoly, where that sort of intelligence is important. So as a result, what have you got going on here? You've got a demand and marginal revenue structure. It looks something like this. You've got a demand curve. And I know that we initially started in the text talking about the fact that you've got a flatter demand curve than what you've got in monopoly. but not as super flat as you do, which is pretty much vertical or horizontal in perfect competition. And that really depends. I mean, I think it's a little bit misleading in some ways because it really depends upon what the objective, where that firm is in terms of its pricing power. In other words, we talked about this on Monday, this idea to try to rotate the demand curve. This is a real thing. This is not some hypothetical, gray-haired old men on whiteboards in academic settings. This is what firms try to do. That is try to elevate, try to make their good inelastic. That is, make it seem as though your product is the only product that's available. Even though everyone, of course, knows that there are usually substitutes for all goods that are out there, but to the extent that you can get buyers to acknowledge the fact that this is the good I want, Glad trash bags, Excedrin pain reliever, or, I mean, it goes on and on and on, whatever, plus shampoo. I mean, these are all huge brand names, and as a result, people will pay probably more, $1 per unit more, whatever. I mean, there is a reason why you get these coupons in the mail, for 25 cents off. It's usually not for the generics at all, because you don't need to convince somebody to buy generics if they're already price sensitive. It's always for name brand goods, usually sort of top of the market. And what they're really trying to do there, more than just trying to give you free money, is they're trying to determine how inelastic their demand curve is. They're trying to determine that price elasticity of demand. That is, if you offer 25 cents off on Palmolive dishwashing liquid, what's the demand response going to be? In other words, what's the change in quantity demanded going to be? Are you going to sell a lot more? Or if it doesn't change much at all, then why give anybody a discount? If people are going to demand the same quantity as before. So it lets the demand side, on the supply side, know what the demand side is up to, because it's this constant market research. And that's not the only tool at all in the toolbox of marketers. There are lots of tools that they use: market surveys, blind studies, focus groups that come in from time to time. And occasionally you'll see ads in the newspaper or one ads for people to participate in blind product testing. And this happens all the time when people come in and they say, drink this cup of coffee. What do you think about this cup of coffee? And rate these on the scale from 1 to 10 or whatever. That sort of thing. Those are all additional tools in addition to advertising. And I'll talk a bit about advertising before we move on to oligopoly. So you've got, let's just say, a generic 45-degree down demand curve, and you've got a marginal revenue curve looks something like that. So again, all the firms that produce in these imperfectly competitive industries have this division between demand and marginal revenue, where there's a split due to what's called the negative price effect. That is the idea, and we talked about this before, where you've got two sort of vectors slugging out: price. Then as you produce more, you've got to bring the price down in order to sell more. So you've got price going down while the quantity is going up. But keep in mind, total revenue is price times quantity. So if price goes down and quantity goes up, who wins the battle? Does price overwhelm quantity, or does quantity overwhelm price? And the answer is, in these structures, the price effect overwhelms the output effect. And so as a result, and because it's a downward sloping thing, we call the negative price effect. So as a result, this declines faster than demand itself does. So we've got a marginal revenue curve looking something like this. So far, this doesn't look too much different than a monopoly. We've got a marginal cost curve looking something like that. And to the extent that a firm can achieve monopolistic pricing, particularly in the short run, all firms in all industries are going to want to produce where the quantity is equivalent to the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost. Always, 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 always. That's listed on your PowerPoint slides. And in the case of imperfectly competitive firms, they'll simply mark up the price at whatever the demand side is willing to pay. And so you have a price, and we'll call it a monopoly price. Because why? Because it differs from the competitive price, which is simply what? If the marginal cost curve is one and the same as the supply curve, because what is upward sloping on a PQ plane, supply, right? Then if it's upward sloping, then where demand and supply come together, in perfect competition, we have a price here. So this is not a monopoly. This looks like a monopoly model, but this is monopolistic competition, because remember, we talked about the fact that even though it sounded like an oxymoron, how can you have monopolistic competition when you were presented, monopoly is the North Pole, perfect competition is the South Pole, whatever, positive, negative, they're completely opposite one another. But yet there's a hybrid form that incorporates both, Why does it incorporate both? It's because of the long run that we will get to here in a second. So this would be the short run model, profit maximizing model in the short run. And so to that extent, the firm could earn economic profit. And what is not reflected here would be something like this. That would be the average total cost curve looking like that. And I know your text has that listed as AC as opposed to ATC. It's the same thing, average total cost, average cost. What that is simply the cost per unit, and it will differ depending on where you are in the scale of your production in the short run. In the longer run, remember, we have these different curves because of different input mixes over time. Remember, that's what it looks like in the very long run, is that you've got different sorts of scale. But in the short run, this is the particular applicable model. Okay, so that's what's going on with the short run model. And again, where we left off last time was sort of talking about this notion of profit, where we said, okay, well, if price is, and let's just get rid of the competitive price right now, that if that profit is what? It's the difference between price minus cost, right? So as a result, this entire shaded region then is profit. And so we can, and actually it's got a, so this is always zero, right? So let's say that the price of the good is, I don't know, 20, and the cost per unit is 15, right? So ATC at the profit maximizing quantity, the profit maximizing ATC is 15, okay? And let's say this is 500, okay? So what is the amount of profit? This is a 20, it's a zero. So what is it then? Well, it's $5 per unit, right? Times 500 units. So remember, and this is simply profit, right? It's total revenue minus total cost. Total revenue is simply 20 times 500, which would be what? 10,000, right? Cost would be 15 times 500, which is whatever that is, I guess 7,500. So what is the profit amount then? It's simply at $5 per unit times 500, right? Which is going to be $2,500. 10,000 minus 7,500 is $2,500. I didn't write that very clearly, did I? And that's total profit. It's not profit per unit, because profit per unit is $5, 20 minus 5. This is $2,500, and that is profit. And we're going to assume it's economic profit because, and without getting into the tall weeds of what might go into the implicit cost mix here, we're just assuming as economists that we've got it in there, okay? And again, it's don't be confused with marginal cost. Marginal cost is simply the cost as we go from one unit to the next, to the next, to the next, or what is probably more applicable, particularly in consumer goods, which is really what we're mostly talking about with monopolistic competition. It's the next 10,000 units, or the next million units, right? As we go from one incremental level to the next. The ATC is simply the unit cost, and all that region there is profit, okay? Now, here is the problem with perfect competition, or excuse me, with monopolistic competition. And that is this: economic profit is being earned, okay? Now we go back to one of the characteristics of perfect competition, and that is what? If economic profit is being earned and barriers to entry are low, and remember that was one of the big characteristics of perfect competition, where we said, look, if growing soybeans is going to make me gigantic amounts of money, and it doesn't really cost me all that much more money to grow soybeans next year as opposed to growing wheat, then let's grow soybeans. Let's all make money. So, but by doing that, what happens, right? Well, the supply curve will shift to the right. And as it shifts to the right, it brings the price down to the point where, what's the point of having monopoly pricing? When it eventually comes back to equal the cost of production. This is what's known as a zero, long run, zero profit equilibrium. And that is the idea that in monopolistic competition, this differs from perfect competition in the short run, because as you've got a product that can command monopoly-like pricing, and maybe the term monopolistic competition is a little bit misleading. And I know that in courses that I teach where students have to write essays and papers and whatnot, sometimes people get real confused about monopoly and monopolistic competition. They'll sort of think they're one and the same, and they are not one and the same. Monopolistic competition in the long run is considered to look more like perfect competition, because why? Barriers to entry are low. So for a company that makes, think about a consumer product. a cola or a diaper or a cigarette brand or a paper towel or trash bags or shampoo or, I mean, all these goods that I've been talking about here. I mean, it's not a huge leap to get into these particular markets. And we have seen in the soft drink market, new competitors come along all the time. It isn't just dominated by Coke and Pepsi, even though if you were to look at a textbook from the, say, 50s or whatever, you would see that the market for soda was mostly what we would call duopolistic, that it was Coke and Pepsi, they were the big players in town, which is not to say that you didn't have at those times Fanta and Knee-High. I mean, these are not strong brands then. They weren't strong brands then, they're not strong brands now. I can remember as a kid, my grandparents lived in the South, they had something called Bubble Up. It was called Bubble Up Cola. I am sure that doesn't exist anymore, but it was basically Coke. It was what it was. But I mean, these different brands have always been out there, but they dominated. Well, now today, Coke and Pepsi don't necessarily dominate. You've got Arizona brands, you've got all these sports drinks, you've got these energy drinks. They are really taking a lot of market share. You've got the coffee kind of drinks that Starbucks and others sort of make. So they don't dominate that space like they once did. Now, that's not to say that Coke and Pepsi are on their way to zero economic profit. Because why? Well, there's an exception here to that rule where, yes, if firms are making economic profit and there's additional supply, you can bring price down because the price will come down as the supply curve shifts to the right. And I could draw a bunch of supply curves here, I guess, and we'll see the price, coming down. Marginal revenues here, marginal costs is there. So now we're moving up here, the price is falling. Now we're moving up here, the price is falling to the point where, so, I mean, just look at what we've got here. We've got everywhere the price is falling as we are shifting the supply curve to the right. Due to the entrance of new firms, the price is coming down, right? So that's what makes the long-run economic profit condition possible. So then you might ask, well, why do we have firms then that have been around for a very, very, very long time and still must be earning economic profit because they charge $1 or $2 more per unit for what is essentially the same good? And then we get into this function of a particular odd brand of product known as super brands. Super brands. And there's something about super brands that is interesting. They've got, for here, the long run conditions are thought to apply, that we're not saying that gravity does not apply to the super brands. We're just simply saying we don't know when the gravity is going to take place, where enough competitors will come along and push it out, or people will get tired of the product, or it'll be replaced by some other kind of technology. But we do know that at some point it probably will, just given what we know or what we think we know about modern economics. So I'm trying to plug my laptop in here, so pardon me just a minute here. And that is, what about these super brands? What is it that is interesting about them that makes their gravity, defy gravity in the long run? And it's because of the fact that they are among a handful of brands, and they really are among a handful of brands that have this sort of staying power, simply because they are so well known as brands. And Coke would be one of them. So Coca-Cola, certainly, there's no question about it. In fact, anywhere in the world that you travel, and I mean almost anywhere, even some of the most desolate, impoverished countries in the world, you'll be able to buy a Coke usually. Sometimes it'll be a little warmer than what we're used to, but you should be able to find it. Or things like Saran Wrap, or Lysol, or Reynolds Wrap. These are brands that go on. And by the way, what is the main Kleenex? Another one. What is the main characteristic of all of these goods? Is that they are synonymous with the product that they represent. And that is, in the entire category, if somebody says, let's go get a Coke, they might not literally mean a Coke, they might mean an orange or a grape or whatever, but Coke is sort of synonymous with the entire class of goods. Or Kleenex, Kleenex is not the only brand of tissue, there are all kinds of others, but we know it by that name. And the same goes with Reynolds Wrap, lots of competition. People are willing to pay that price because they know the name. Saran Wrap, same way. And there are all kinds of products that we think of along those particular lines. That the good itself is synonymous with, or the brand itself is synonymous with the good, whether or not we even buy the good itself. And so as a result, these super brands have sort of an indefinite life, and there are not many of them. I mean, it seems like there would be a lot of them, but there really are not. I mean, there are only a few brands that meet. I'm sure I'm not covered on all of the characteristics. I know I'm probably missing some, and they may come to me a bit later as we get going. But they sort of defy gravity because they hang on. So they don't move down toward this long-run economic profit. And there's another issue too, and this is really hard to graph, and so I won't even attempt to. But some of these goods have been produced for so long. And by the way, there is some downward gravity. I don't mean to suggest that there's zero downward movement as new goods come along. But first of all, the cost structure itself might kind of go down, mostly because that is, you would bring the ATC down because it becomes cheaper and cheaper to make these goods because the equipment that is used to make the goods has been around for so long, it doesn't need to be replaced, just needs to be maintained. Some of this equipment is decades old, and they just keep cranking out the same product over and over again. It doesn't cost that much to produce some of these goods. They just keep producing it. So as long as firms are making positive profit from producing these goods, and in the business world, they tend to look more at a financial point of view than implicit costs usually don't factor into it that much, frankly, even though as economists we advise that they ought to, and sometimes they do. But they're looking more at cash flows. So if we're getting more cash out of it than what we're putting into it, let's keep on doing it. And that's certainly logical because remember, we're measuring everything on this axis in terms of dollars. And cash flows are more something that you would study in a finance course, but I want everybody to be cognizant of the fact that I'm aware of that in the corporate world, they tend to focus on things like rate of return. What kind of rate of return are we getting off it based upon what is our cost to do it, our cost of capital? What does it cost us to produce, 50 million boxes of Kleenex or whatever the situation is. So their cost structure may come down simply as a result of these efficiencies that are gained over time, simply because they've been doing it for so long. And they've been doing it better than anybody else. And they oftentimes have a head start in the market and they get out there. And I think there's a lot to be said with that idea of getting a head start. I mean, some of these brands are unremarkable in the extreme, there's nothing really very complicated about any of these super brands that I talked about. But because they got an early start, they got branding out there. It was discovered pretty early on in the history of consumer, particularly consumer packaged goods. That if you put a brand name on it, it's going to sell better than if you don't have a brand name on it. And even for goods that are very almost generic, almost look like perfect competition, things like canned foods that do have brand names and frozen foods that have brand names on them, Bird's Eye, Campbell's, you name it. There's nothing particularly remarkable about these products. They may not even be qualitatively the best in their particular category. Certainly in terms of health consciousness, a lot of people could argue against some of these processed foods. It doesn't make any difference really from an economic standpoint in the sense that they've got this brand dominance that's going on. So these are important things to consider, and they're things that we ought not to discount, because I think the importance of them is really important for our understanding of what is going on with regard to the long run. And so that's really what the long run issue is, what's called zero profit equilibrium. So economic profit in the long run is considered to be zero. Okay, and then one final thing I want to talk about here is this idea of promotion and advertising. And what's really interesting about it is this, that the advertising, a lot of these goods that are super brands don't advertise very much. And so I don't want I bring up the topic of super brands because they're sort of an anomaly, to be real honest with you. They've been around a very, very, very long time. And in a lot of ways, they don't really advertise very much. When they do, it's maybe some new variation on the good itself. It's just something different that is being introduced. But often they don't, because people know the brands. There's no need to promote them. So what goods receive a lot of advertising? Well, goods for which there's a lot of competition in the market. And there are some industries that are hyper competitive in terms of price, despite the fact that we would classify them as monopolistically competitive, mostly because of the fact that they do things better, faster, cheaper than a lot of their competitors. And so as a result, we would classify them there. But here's where the role of advertising comes in. And this is also a bit tricky. I wish I had some slides on this, but I really don't. And this is one of the downsides of this technology is I tend to have some transparencies in the physical classroom. I can simply show up here, but we don't really have projectors anymore. slide projectors, and so that's kind of a bummer. So anyway, if you've got a demand marginal revenue set up looking at something like that, and let's say you've got an average total cost, and we'll simply call ATC 0. Okay, so again, and we'll just say the firm is producing where marginal revenue is marginal cost. So the firm is going to be producing right here. Okay, at this level of output, and then they're earning profit from this to here all the way back, and it's a area of the rectangle is what's going on here. It's basically length times width. That's all that's really happening. 500 times 5 is $2,500. So they're making it a positive economic profit because which we know because the price is here, the cost per unit is here. So what about advertising? What does advertising do? Well, it's expensive, and so as a result, sometimes the average total cost group is now going to shift upward. And so what justifies this? The only way that this can be justified is if you have a new demand marginal revenue condition that looks something like that. So we'll call that D0, MR0, MR1, D1, where now you have to have a higher price, which is what advertising is seeking to achieve, and a higher output level, which is again what advertising is seeking to achieve, in order to justify the higher amount of expenditure. So you're going to have more, you're going to have a higher price and more output, but it's the only way that you could justify that amount of expenditure. And really, when you're talking about advertising, and particularly television advertising, which is the most expensive, it is a function of big business, no question about it. Small businesses may advertise locally. It's expensive. They'll often find themselves late at night advertising. They won't be usually prime time. I'm not saying never. And I guess in smaller markets like Albuquerque, you may see quite a little bit more advertising than what you'd see in some of the bigger markets where you don't have very much local advertising, unless it's pretty dominant within their market, because it does cost a lot. During the prime time, though, it's usually advertising that's dominated by national players, international brands and whatnot that advertise. And as a result, because it's expensive. And those of you who follow the Super Bowl and all that will know that Super Bowl advertising is the most expensive of all, just because there are a lot of eyeballs on it. And advertising agencies and firms that buy the advertising will spend months ahead of the Super Bowl trying to think of something that really catches the eye, so people remember it and they keep talking about it. And they know to what extent it drives demand for the product. They can tell whether drives demand for the product, and when it does not pay off through Super Bowl advertising, they quit doing it. In fact, advertisers will quit doing it, particularly in terms of economic downturns, where demand for everything shifts this way, advertising comes down right away. And that's why I said, like on Monday, that during the most recent recession that we had, macro recession, a lot of these consumer products firms were just backing away from the market. And we saw a lot of the advertising just dominated by insurance companies, just insurance ad after insurance ad. And one of the things about it is it has a fairly inelastic demand curve. People don't switch insurance companies a lot, but the idea is to get people to switch, because once you go over to another insurance company, you're probably not going to switch again. But to get you over there is a good thing. And then they try to get your homeowners and your autos and life insurance, and maybe try to sell you an annuity and a 529 plan for your children. I mean, no. And that's, by the way, Wells Fargo, that's what they got in trouble for doing. I know they're a bank, not an insurance company. They're trying to get people to buy more products because they know the more products you have in a financial company, the less likely you're willing to leave. So if some employee says something really rude or stupid to you, then you won't walk out the door necessarily if you're tied in. So this is what advertising does: it shifts the entire complex out. Okay, so are there questions for me about anything with regard to the sort of the characteristics of monopolistic competition? All right, well, before we move on to oligopoly, then let's just talk about what some of the examples that are of monopolistically competitive firms. Some of these I've mentioned before, like consumer packaged goods. That's number one on the list, mostly because of the fact that it sort of almost defines the realm of what we're talking about here is mostly consumer goods, but not exclusively. And even the ones under that in that list on the PowerPoint package are mostly consumer goods, designer apparel, Nobody has to have designer goods, but they're willing to pay more for them because of the cachet, because of the stylistic nature of them. A lot of people like the label. You know, I was an undergraduate at the time when the preppy movement was going on, and so everybody had to have the right kind of designer apparel, and that sort of went away in some respects, which I think is probably a good thing. But it's never going to go away all the way. It still exists, but in a different sort of form. Cosmetics, perfumes, that's a really heavily branded product, also heavily advertised, particularly print advertising. A lot of that is print, and you know, there's lots of advertising there, and particularly with things with perfumes, they will have little samples embedded within the ads themselves. So if you've read any kind of magazine that deals with fashion, men's or women's, by the way, that you'll oftentimes have some scents that are there that you can sample, so you get an idea for yourself, which is pretty ingenious if you think about it. Sporting goods, heavily branded product. You know, I know that as a person who has been in sports most of my life, I can tell you that as a baseball player, I had to have a certain mitt, and that was it. I wouldn't even consider choosing a different brand of baseball mitt. Golf clubs, I use one brand of golf clubs and have forever, and so I will admit to being a creature of habit, and that's what these sellers of goods expect, is that we get to know what's going on, we understand the product. By the way, I don't think I've got this in the PowerPoint package, but maybe I do, but maybe I don't. But it's the idea of one of the explanations for the higher price is the idea of what's known as consumption insurance. Consumption insurance, that is, it's not actual insurance, but it's the idea we pay a little more, but we pay a premium, and there's no secret as to why insurance companies use the word premium to define the price of the product. But we're willing to pay a little bit more for the good because we know exactly what that good does every single time. There's no surprise. And the producers of those goods will go out of their way to make sure that you have that same experience every time, because that's what you're paying for. And when we talked about the example of New Coke on Monday, it was considered to be really one of the biggest flops, failures, fiascos in marketing history, frankly. And nobody's really repeated that mistake on these heavily branded goods, especially one that achieved a super brand sort of status. So it was a big blunder, but they were facing lots of competition from Pepsi. This was in the wake of what were known as the Cola Wars, where Coke and Pepsi were just going at each other. And they were in a full-on price war. And we'll talk maybe a little bit about price wars when we get into oligopoly, but price wars are basically what you would think they are. They're races to the bottom to gain customers and market share at the sacrifice of profit. Particularly in the short run, the idea is that maybe you hurt your competitor more than he or she hurts you. Well, I say he or she, these are firms, these are people. But that's a difficult proposition. Most economists, and I think most people in the business world, would agree that price wars help nobody except the buyer, and that's maybe only short run, because somebody's got to call the price war off at some point. You know, so I think that's important. I think there's been a price war going on in the pizza delivery business now for some time. I really do. I think the prices were going up for pizzas, and I think they're beginning to be a little bit more reasonable in terms of coming down in price. And this was well before the pandemic. I think there's sort of a price where there's a lot of competition for what are very heavily branded goods, quite frankly. Hotels and motels, no doubt about it. If you're driving somewhere and you are out of town, maybe you're driving on a pull over for the night, you're going to almost always go to, you know, somewhere, maybe it's Travelodge or Ramada Inn or whatever, before you go to, you know, Claude and Jean's discount hotel. I mean, who knows what kind of nightmare you're going to run into there, right? So you pretty much have an idea that there'll be some sort of quality assurance. Whereas if you're staying at some no-name motel, who knows, right? Who knows what you're getting into, right? I know that I was driving one time back to Albuquerque from somewhere. I went back east to visit my family. I was just really tired. Pulled over in some god-awful place in the middle of nowhere, and it was just an awful place. And I got in like 4 in the morning. At 8 in the morning, they were calling and saying, you need to get out of the room because we need to clean it. And I said, I just got here 4 hours ago. Doesn't matter. And then they called about half an hour later. I am up. think I'm shaving and getting dressed. You need to get out of the room. It's like, I'm working on it. And then they call back and say, we're going to call the sheriff. It's like, what are you talking about? I can't imagine that kind of treatment ever in a Holiday Inn or whatever, where we're going to call the sheriff because you haven't left the room by what, 8:30. It's just absolutely ridiculous. But these kind of horror stories of these unbranded, these small businesses that just don't know how to operate and don't care, and they're not looking for long run repeat business. That's what makes buyers flock to the branded products. Frankly, it just really does. You know what you're getting. And frankly, being the son of a lawyer, I can tell you that if you have a really bad experience, you've got somebody to sue, whereas you probably don't have anybody to sue at this crummy motel in the middle of Missouri, I think it was. So you kind of get the idea that there's a reason why people flock to the branded products. Insurance, we talked about. Insurance is heavily branded. Absolutely no question about it. I think that what's interesting is that I see these advertisements on TV, and again, these are big businesses, insurance companies, so TV is where they would tend to go, and they're advertising life insurance for these unbelievably low rates from companies nobody ever heard of. And I'm gonna say, I mean, like they're talking about like selling life insurance, $1 million to a 35-year-old non-smoker for like $20 a month. And I'm thinking, how on earth can they sell that? I mean, at 35, you're probably not going to die, even if you are a secret smoker. But still, $20 a month. You've really got to wonder whether or not that insurance company is going to be around when you do die, which is maybe 50 years from when you buy the policy. I mean, it's something to think about. It really is something to think about. And especially retailers. This is all these firms offer one particular product for which they're known. That is like going to the mall and seeing the place where you can buy baseball caps and whatnot. These are all specialty retailers. And any kind of franchise, franchise retail operation would tend to, by definition, be monopolistically competitive. Okay, so questions for me about any of that? All right, hopefully my voice holds out here. The allergies will not have gotten the better of me in the next 25 minutes. So let's move on. Other questions? I don't see any. So let's move on to oligopoly, which is the second in this chapter 10, and the fourth and final one in this market structure discussion, oligopoly. What is oligopoly? In some ways, oligopolies are really interesting. Economists spend lots of time studying them because of the fact that their behaviors are so interesting in a lot of ways. And yet we all know these industries, even though we may not think of them as oligopolistic. By the way, I'll say one thing at the outset, because as we start talking about some examples of oligopolistic industries, you might think, well, wait a minute, isn't that monopolistically competitive? Or is it oligopoly? Now, maybe you won't say that, but maybe you'll wonder that. And there is overlap. There's no question that there's overlap there. And it's sometimes hard to know. And I'll give you one example. And that is, even when I was an undergraduate, even as a graduate student, that the exemplar of a oligopolistic industry was the auto industry in this country. And that was, you had three big competitors, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, and all the brands which existed underneath them, whether it was Dodge or Oldsmobile or Mercury, they were all subsets of the same big manufacturing firms dominated by three. And the definition of an oligopoly is a industry run only by a few competing firms. And the idea of few is anywhere from 2 to maybe the outside a dozen, I think. That might be, and 12 might be too high. In fact, a lot of times 4 is sort of the magic number. And we're going to talk about this, the power of the number 4 as we get going here. But it was considered to be the exemplar of oligopoly, almost the classic example. If you want to know how oligopolies behave, study the auto industry. They do things, they have the same structures that all oligopolies are going to have. However, since I guess, at least the 1980s, there's been such an influx of new automobiles coming made elsewhere that you've got other brands that have good market share. Toyota has a bigger market share now than any other single firm. It's the biggest car company, not the biggest truck company, the biggest car company in America right now. Toyota. There's also Honda, there's Mitsubishi, there's Hyundai, Kia, BMW, Mercedes, Land Rover. These are all, none of those are the big three at all whatsoever. None of them have any connection to GM, Ford, or Chrysler. So it's really, that industry is really more monopolistically competitive. Just simply because the fact that because number one, the economy's gotten bigger. So as a result, there's more product being sold, and you can move down your long run average cost curve if you sell more units. There are no such thing really as small automotive companies, where if you're going to start a business, that's probably the last business you would start is that or aerospace or something like that, is the auto business. They're all big businesses, which is why they were considered oligopolistic, because one of the characteristics that we're going to say, excuse me, with regard to oligopolies, is that these are, without a question, big businesses. And so when we talk about an industry dominated by a few players, we've got to be a little bit careful in saying, okay, a small town in wherever that might have 4 doctors, are they an oligopoly? Well, not really, because they probably don't behave like an oligopoly. The doctors probably aren't surveilling each other, seeing what one doctor is doing. What can we do to do things a little bit differently, mix it up a little bit, change our product around? Really? No, it doesn't. That's not the behavior of oligopolies. It just so happens it's a small town, so maybe 4 doctors is all that can be supplied, or 2 tire stores, or 3 pet groomers. I mean, you get the idea that just because of number itself does not make an industry. So unlike monopolies, where there are local monopolies simply because the market is either too small, or in the case of a natural monopoly, the market can't sustain profitably 2 competitors. Unlike those characteristics, oligopoly doesn't work that way. These are all big businesses, and they all sort of have to meet most of these characteristics in order to sort of qualify. So the auto industry, I think most of us would not classify it, even though I think there are, we should not extrapolate and say, oh, well, vehicles then are monopolistically competitive. I would say that in reality, most of the vehicles probably are oligopolistic. Snowmobiles, motorcycles, that's a small industry for the most part. Aircraft, no question about it. Boats, maybe. I don't know as much about boats, but I would say, so I wouldn't take just the auto industry and say all vehicles now must be monopolistically competitive, because I think there is a concentration of a few firms in a lot of those industries. And I hope I don't put have auto as a, I do have autos as an example. So anyway, that, you could say autos. I think most of us are saying today monopolistic competition. I'm going to have to take that off there, because I think monopolistic competition is where that industry mostly is. Okay. All right. So what are some of the characteristics? So we're talking about a few firms. That's the definition. And what we say about these firms is they are strategically interdependent. Now, what does that mean? Strategically interdependent. When you think of, and for those of you who are business students, you probably will take, even if you finish your associates at CNN, and I know not everyone does. I know a lot of people pick and choose courses from CNN, perfectly fine. But I know that if you finish the bachelor's program in business, that you will probably come across some form of strategic management courses. Because I know, because I do teach a little bit in the business school, and I'm a little bit familiar with their curriculum. So what is that about? It's all about long run planning, about anything strategically related is about long run planning, about plans and strategies that a firm makes for its future primarily. It's very much forward looking. And given that fact, in an oligopolistic industry, there's a recognition that all firms in that industry are interdependent upon one another, particularly in the form of price, but also in terms of the form of the product. That there's a lot of copycat going on. That the form of the product in an oligopolistic industry is pretty much the same. And there are some variations, but what defines the structure really is this idea of interdependence. And as we'll see here in a second, this price leadership, price following sort of conduct. Okay. So there is a leading firm and a following firm. Now, this is interesting. And I just mentioned the idea of price leadership and price following. It is the case that pricing tends to be heavily closely monitored by firms in oligopolistic industries. And that is the idea that firms watch what each other are doing and will follow suit. If one firm lowers the price of the product, others will follow suit fairly quickly, because of the fact that the form of the good oftentimes is not that big of a deal, where it is with monopolistic competition, quite frankly. it is a monopolistic competition, which is one reason why in the auto industry, people do have brand loyalty and brand attachment, and therefore maybe wouldn't consider buying a Toyota because they're loyal to Chevrolet or whatever. So you get the idea. So I know I kind of regret that probably has been up there too long. Autos as an example, but vehicles themselves probably are oligopolistic in many ways. But this idea of price leading, price following, the best example I can give you on that is the airline industry, which is another, and has been and still is, frankly, one of the exemplars of oligopolistic industries. And that is particularly in terms of price leadership and price following. It's often the case that one airline will change its fares and everybody else will change its fares. And if you've ever looked on Priceline or Expedia or whatever, and just try to book a flight, and maybe, it's not like you sometimes I punch in scenarios just to say, what would it cost to go to fly to New York or fly to LA or whatever. And I'll put in some dates and whatnot. And the first few that come back are going to be the exact same price with different air carriers. I'm not talking about close, I'm talking about exact same price, $419 per person, $419, right? And then you get down to the lower fares where you have to leave at like 4 in the morning and get in at like 11:30 at night or whatever, right? It was a little less desirable, and you have an 8-hour layover in Atlanta or something, right? Or Dallas Fort Worth, which is where I spent a lot of time in. But you get the idea that for the product that people really want, the price is not similar; it's the same. If one firm changes the price and it's considered a leading firm, the others will follow. United Airlines oftentimes was considered that leading firm, and it would change its prices, and everyone else would change. Lower the fares, they would all lower them. And you would oftentimes hear news stories about United Airlines lower their fares on most of its domestic routes than everybody else did that same day, exactly the same. If they raised their fares, everybody else would raise their fares. They were sort of the leading firm in that. They had the biggest market share at one time, and they were considered to be the leader of that particular market. And we're going to talk a bit about collusion and what that's about. That is an illegal activity. But there was a very famous case of the FBI, who was really examining the idea of collusion in the airline industry, was putting a wiretap on the telephone of the CEO of American Airlines years ago, not the current CEO, but several CEOs back. His name was Robert Crandall. I'll just give you his name because it's a public record. And he was caught talking to the CEO of United saying, why are we beating each other's brains in? Why don't you raise your fares and I'll raise my fares? We'll all make money. And the CEO of United was reacting with horror, saying, we can't talk about prices. Click, hung up the phone. And that was the right thing to have done. And Crandall never went to my knowledge, never got any jail time or was ever charged. But he tried. And I think that if United had gone along with it, I am sure that the American would have gone along with it. But that sort of price fixing is called collusion, and is an illegal activity. And that's one of the problems with oligopolies, which is why that chapter 10 leads nicely into chapter 11, because when we talk about industrial regulation, oftentimes it's not just directed at monopolies, which are the most extreme form, but less common form. Oligopolies are much more common, and they have there's a lot more chance of collusion. Because remember, what was the thing that we talked about with perfect competition? We've got thousands of sellers. How on earth could you ever get them to agree on the same price? Whereas if every soybean farm in the United States somehow got together on where? On Facebook or in the Superdome, right? That wouldn't be very secret, right? And got together and said, we're going to raise the price. We're going to demand higher prices. It can't happen, wouldn't happen. And even if they even made the attempt, you'd probably have a lot of people cheating. And the evidence for that is the fact that the cartel that at one time really dominated the market price for oil, OPEC, would set a price here for a target price for oil. And yet once that price got to that, then you have members that were cheap, take advantage of that price and just open the spigot. But by opening the spigot, they would shift the supply curve to the right and bring the price down, which defeated the purpose in the first place. And so that group of only a dozen or so countries couldn't get it together to control the price. So why would 1,000 or 20,000 soybean producers be able to do the same thing? Look at 4 producers, yeah, no question about it. They could do it if they wanted to, which is why it's illegal. And we'll talk much more about that anti-competitive behavior. Okay, so firms are competitive with one another, often intensely so. Often intensely so is very important to talk about. In other words, they are not cartels. Now, I just talked about OPEC as a cartel. Let's talk about what cartels are. Let's give a definition of a cartel. A cartel is a cooperating group of producers. And what's unfortunate is, like so many things that come out of the press, when we hear the word cartel, a lot of us think of the drug trade and drug cartels that dominate the drug trade in what, cocaine or meth or whatever coming out of Mexico or Colombia or Peru or whatever. Those really aren't cartels. I mean, there is cooperation that goes on, but there's also a lot of non-cooperation. The fact that they sometimes shoot each other, that doesn't sound much like a cartel to me. That's really not what a cartel is. A cartel is a rather cordial business relationship where firms get together and engage in a form of collusion. And the collusion that we're talking about has got a particular sort of name, and it's called tacit collusion. Tacit collusion. So what a cartel is a cooperating group of producers that engage in collusion, that is agreement on price. Now, let's just, like the Bob Crandall conversation, you raise your price, I'll raise my price, we'll all be happy, right? Illegal activity. But tacit means what? It means unspoken, subtle, and they kind of go along with it, okay? There is some of that in oligopolies even today. That's why when one firm in a oligopolistic industry does raise their prices, others will raise it because they are tacitly colluding. There is, I'm sure, no telephone calls back and forth, given that experience with United and American, and that's been many, many decades ago. But it was a very famous case at the time. So today, the collusion is tacit. But that's an oligopolistic behavior. This is a cartel is outright. The OPEC oil cartel doesn't do anything necessarily. I mean, they don't even have the courtesy to do it behind closed doors. They meet in Vienna and say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to limit output, and we're going to therefore move the market price to 105 per barrel. And they're very open about the fact that they're trying to rip off the demand side when they can. Now, we don't hear as much about OPEC as we have in previous years, mostly because of the fact that they're not at all the dominant player that they once were, despite the fact they have cartel status. The United States does not have membership in that because the United cartels are illegal in the United States. They're also illegal in Europe. But we've got a lot of oil companies in the United States, and we've got a lot of oil companies in Europe. And I mean, Norway, for instance, OPEC has tried for years to get Norway to join the cartel. Norway is a gigantic oil producer, and they are not willing to do that. And they don't want to really cooperate. Mostly, I think Norway is a NATO member. They've got a lot more in connection ties with America and Europe than they do with what are mostly Middle Eastern states, mostly undemocratic states, led by almost feudal-like sheiks and kings. And that's just their political setup. And so Norway and France is a big an oil producer. Italy is an oil producer. Britain is an oil producer. Shell Oil is basically a very, very old British and Dutch companies owned by, they call themselves Anglo-Dutch. They're based in Holland, but they have mostly British ownership. So there's a lot of other producers in town now, and have been for quite a long time, than the OPEC cartel. So the oil industry, I cannot be considered that. In fact, if anything, it's probably mostly perfect competition. And that sounds crazy when you consider the fact that if you go all the way back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and when the oil industry really started back around, say, pick a year, 1870 probably, that industry has probably been the most profitable of any single industry since the industrialization began. However, they're competing, but the monopoly that John D. Rockefeller constructed and wasn't very successfully dismantled by the government, and we'll see why it wasn't very successfully dismantled, earned economic profit for years, I mean, decades. It just kept it going decade after decade. So as a result of that, in this country, at least, it's something worse than a cartel, you got a monopoly. But even still, with all the competition, oil companies do suffer when the market price goes down. No question about it. And I'm somebody who's owned oil stocks forever. And right now, I'm very happy. Oil prices are high. My stock prices are high. I'm fat and happy. I like it. I don't like to pay $4.09 or whatever per gallon, but I like this. And if the price falls once again from $102 per barrel, which is where it is today, at least it was this morning before I left the house. If it falls back to 30, I won't be as happy, but I'll like paying $2 a gallon. So maybe think about buying oil stocks when you have a little bit of, if you have a little bit of savings and whatnot. And they pay good dividends, and it takes some of the sting out of a little higher prices. So cartels are formations that are they're not legal. Now, back to this idea of competition in terms of price. Yes, there's tacit collusion when it can exist, but for the most part, though, where this does not exist, there is intense competition. And firms are oftentimes very competitive with one another, and they're particularly competitive in terms of trying to get new customers and trying to steal customers and to try to get people to switch to their particular product. Barriers to entry and exit are high. This is another explanatory factor as to why these numbers are so small of competitors. It just takes a lot of money to get into some of these industries. We've only got 4 railroads in the United States that dominate the market. And again, there's a magic number 4 that seems to be something about the lowest number that oligopoly can really get to, because this idea of 2 competitors is almost too small. It almost attracts too much regulatory scrutiny. If Coke and Pepsi had not gotten the new competition from these other players, I'm reasonably sure the government would probably have done something about them. Even though, Coke and Pepsi are not life and death industries like transportation, like rail is. But keep in mind, there are 4 main rail companies in this country, which is not to say there aren't very many small players, right? There are smaller players, but they don't really move the needle. It's 4 big players: Union Pacific, Norfolk Southern, Burlington Northern Santa Fe, and I think I'm missing one, Southern Pacific maybe. I think those are the 4 big producers, and everyone else is smaller. Okay, just kind of like a monopoly where maybe one big player and then other really, really small players. So that industry is mostly competitive. But it's high. What are the barriers to entry for a railroad company? Gigantic. And a lot of the machinery that's being used is decades old. Some of these rail cars look and are old. But if you were going to enter brand new, you have to go buy some of these old cars. And why would you want to buy something old if you're going to be in it for a long run? So to buy new stuff, it would just be massively high. And also the barriers to exit are high. Once you're in the railroad industry, you can't really convert that to anything else. You're in the rail industry. Other industries are difficult to get into, pharmaceuticals, difficult to get into, aerospace and whatnot. And by the way, a lot of these firms have been buying each other for many, many years in order to get to scale, to move down that long run average cost curve, because bigger firms can produce more output at lower cost per unit. The drug industry has been buying each other up for years and years. A lot of competitors that used to exist are now part of bigger firms, and the same with the railroad industry and the airline industry. We've got fewer airlines now, mostly because of mergers, or like United bought Continental, American bought US Air, all these sorts of combinations, to the point where now we've got really United, American, Southwest, and I'm probably missing somebody here, but it's not a big industry domestically. Internationally, different story. Okay, the products tend to be similar enough and nearly identical. Okay, so this is the case. So take the airline industry. I don't know about you, but there are times when I've been flying, and sometimes I've got a layover, and they'll be calling the name of an airline, and I'll forget what airline I'm on, and I got to pull out my ticket to see. And sometimes I just have an e-ticket. I got to flip through my phone. What airline am I? I forgot what airline I'm on. Right. Particularly if I've been traveling and jumping around, moving around. I don't travel anywhere near as much as I used to, but that was fairly common. Why? The experience is the same. It is almost identical. I mean, Southwest differs in the sense you don't have assigned seating and whatnot. You got a lot of short flights, which if you don't mind that, that's okay. But what are called the legacy carriers, United, American, they're pretty much the same. And they're almost identical. There's almost nothing different. They all have the same thing. We know you have choices in airlines, all that kind of good stuff. You're the safety warnings. It's practically identical. In fact, if you woke up from a deep sleep on an airplane you wouldn't really know what airline you're on. It's how identical it is. Another example is this idea of leading and following and identical experiences. Broadcasting is the example of the oligopolistic industry. For news, for weather, for sports. Take an example, if you want any, just an example that you can't miss. If you watch football, somebody years ago came up with the yellow line on the screen, which doesn't exist in the stadium. It's just as something they put on the screen to show where the first down line was. I think it was Fox that did that. I could be wrong. But as soon as they did that, everybody else did that. So you can't watch football now without seeing the yellow line. That is just an artificial line the broadcaster put on that. That the experience is identical. It's made to be identical. Because by the way, if Fox has a yellow line, it's like, I really like the yellow line, and I do personally. And NBC doesn't have it, CBS doesn't have it. You know, you're not going to be happy. You want that. You want the yellow line. So as a result, these products are very, very similar. They're very similar. Cola products, very, very similar. Yes, I know that we sometimes seem to think they're monopolistically competitive. And that's, again, there's some overlap there, but these goods are primarily the same. They offer mostly identical products. Even pharmaceuticals, you know, once a drug goes off patent protection, that monopoly, that short-term monopoly protection, a lot of medicines are very, very similar to what other medicines do. Particularly if it's for something that is long ago, an old medication for very old problems that have been around a long time, such as high blood pressure, or heart disease or asthma or cancer. A lot of these drugs are very, very similar. Okay, they've been around for a very long time. Okay, and then economies of scale are prevalent. This explains the low number of competitors. Scale is a big issue. Scale matters. The cost of production matters, and so bigger firms can produce more than what at a lower price than what smaller firms can. And by the way, when it comes to merger mania, we've seen this happening. Firms buying other firms in lots and lots of industries that really now look more oligopolistic. Banking is probably very close to oligopolistic. You notice I didn't mention those in monopolistic competition because I don't know there's a lot of brand loyalty so much in banking. I'm an ex-banker, so I can tell you that there's not that much love of the product from customers. And bankers have gone out of their way to sabotage their own brands in a lot of ways. Wells Fargo just totally made mistakes like you wouldn't believe in customer relations, which hurt others as well. And so it does hurt the image of the industry. The insurance company, the insurance industry has, in fact, probably been much better managed, I would say, over time than the banking industry. But we would call it monopolistically competitive because of the fact that there is brand attachment, brand loyalty. If your parents have State Farm insurance, you're likely to have State Farm insurance. I don't know if your parents bank at Bank of America that you really care if you're going to go there or Rio Grande Credit Union or New Mexico Bank of Trust. I don't know that really attaches so much. But for big banks in the country, though, we're moving more toward oligopoly. And I work for one of the very big banks in the country, and I can tell you that all these characteristics made sense. We were very much strategically interdependent. We watched what each other's did, which all others did. If one firm did one particular product move, we would do the same product move. And by the way, as I think I mentioned to one of my other classes, but one of the explanations for the financial crisis that really took over and caused a recession beginning in 2007, 2008, was the fact that banks were doing these crazy loans to borrowers with no down payments, borrowers with no jobs, no income verification. And as Jamie Dimon, who was the head then and still is of Chase, had said, look, if my competitor is going to do this product, I've got to do that product. So as a result, maybe it's a crazy product, but if they're going to do it, we have to do it. We don't want to lose customers. So as a result, that's why we got ourselves into that mess. So what's to save the industry from itself? Regulation. So and regulation comes up again and again with oligopolistic industries as simply nothing other than a means to protect the public. Okay, so we'll get into some on Monday. We'll get into some examples of beyond the ones I've talked about oligopolistic industries. We'll get a little bit of the structure. We'll talk a bit about the short versus long run implications, and then we don't have much more to do on that. And I do want to get into chapter 12, dealing with externalities. In some ways, I said 12 and 13 can really go together. They really can. They're really the same subject, only they are split up into positive and negative externalities. And we'll take them that way, but really they go together. And I think we have a lot of time to get to that. And then hopefully we'll be able to get to chapter 16, dealing with risk and all those other elements as well. So, okay, so if you have questions for me, feel free to contact me anytime. I'm more than happy to talk with you. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week.